This is the Wizard News. A dramatic rise in accidents killing or injuring pedestrians and bicyclists has led to a myriad of policy and infrastructure changes. But moves to ban the legal prerogative for a driver to turn right after stopping at a red light have drawn some of the most intense sentiments on both sides. Washington, D.C.'s City Council in 2022 approved a right on red ban that takes effect in 2025. Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson's transition plan called for restricting right turns on red, but his administration has not provided specifics. J. Beeber, Executive Director for Policy at the National Motorists Association, an advocacy organization for drivers, cited an upcoming study by his association that analyzed California crash data from 2011 to 2019 and found that drivers turning right on red accounted for only about one pedestrian death and less than one bicyclist death statewide every 2 years. What's really behind this movement is part of the agenda to make driving as miserable and as difficult as possible so people don't drive so much, Beeber said. Safety advocates counter that official crash reports are often mislabeled, undercounting the dangers. The United States is one of few major countries that generally allow right turns on red. Concerned that cars idling at stoplights could compound an energy crisis, the U.S. government warned states in the 1970s that they could risk some federal funding should cities prohibit right on red, except in specific, clearly marked areas. Although another energy-conscious provision capping speed limits at 55 miles per hour has long been abandoned, right on red has endured. Right on red has never been allowed across most of New York City, where large signs alert Manhattan's visitors that the practice is prohibited there. But it was the default policy practically everywhere else in the U.S. until last year's vote in the nation's capital. Safety advocates who pushed for the change in Washington, D.C. are bracing for blowback from drivers, particularly if the city also allows the so-called Idaho stop, in which cyclists are permitted to go through a red light after stopping to make sure the coast is clear. Critics argue that banning right on red will not only inconvenience motorists but also slow down commuter buses and deliveries. The United Parcel Service has not taken an official position on right on red, but has long directed its drivers to avoid left turns whenever possible, viewing them as inefficient. Priya Sarati Jones, Deputy Executive Director at the Fines and Fees Justice Center, is concerned penalties from right on red bans will fall disproportionately on lower income drivers who have to drive to work because they cannot afford housing near public transit. If there is more enforcement at red lights, more cameras are certain to follow, she said. In the Chicago area, any discussion of red light policy often conjures up memories of the region's vilified red light camera program, which spurred bribery charges against public officials. There are no recent nationwide studies of how many people are hurt or killed by right-turning drivers. According to a national report by the Governor's Highway Safety Association, more than 7,500 people walking were struck and killed by automobiles in 2022, the highest number since 1981. The spike, which included all accidents, not just those involving right turns on red, was attributed in part to an increase in larger vehicles such as SUVs and pickup trucks on the road. The Insurance Institute for Highway Safety found that the odds a pedestrian would be killed when struck by an automobile turning right were 89% higher when the vehicle was a pickup and 63% higher when it was an SUV, due to larger blind spots and the deadlier force associated with heavier models. Much of the research looking directly at the impact of right on red policies is years, if not decades old, but both sides argue it is still relevant. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, in a 1994 report to Congress, looked at 4 years of crash data from Indiana, Maryland, and Missouri, and 3 years of data from Illinois, counting a combined 558 injury crashes and 4 fatalities stemming from right turns on red. Advocates of a ban point out that study came before the nation's vehicle fleet grew much larger and more lethal. But, Beeber said, the National Motorists Association study of California found that even when there was an accident associated with right turns on red, at least 96% of the injuries sustained by pedestrians or cyclists were minor. Source: Associated Press, November 4th, 2023.